Elara Moon had learned to move like the wind across the outskirts of town, unseen when she wanted to be, but never entirely gone. The people of Wren's Gulch, their faces sun-creased from hard winters and the thinner years, had made that movement a necessity. They had ways of making a person into a rumor until the rumor swallowed the person whole. For Elara, the rumor had always had a shape and a sound. Half-blood, they would say, and then glance away as if pity were a thing that could be hidden in a coat pocket. Her mother had taught her otherwise. In the small cabin behind the cottonwoods, Nana Wren had a voice like a storybook and hands that smelled of sage and tallow. She had braided Elara's hair in the mornings and hummed songs from a land that belonged to the other side of her blood. "You are two rivers, not a torn map," she told Elara once while mending a saddle and blowing a stray lock of black hair from her granddaughter's brow. "You run deeper for both." But the town did not hear the songs. They remembered the old hurts that settled like dust after a storm. Fear of what they did not understand, the superstition that steeped into every winter conversation. It was easy to shape someone into a scapegoat when the harvest failed, when a child was hurt falling off a wagon, when storms came and the cattle sickened. Elara's differences, her dark eyes that did not match the blonde curls of many in town, a silver counting of small charms sewn beneath her shirt, were turned into evidence. Small things became proof against her. She worked for old Mr. Hannigan at the livery, tending the horses and mending bridles, the only work a town would trust her with. Horses did not gossip. They only listened with damp, patient eyes. They accepted the manner in which Elara moved among them, unhurried and careful. In the morning she would trim hooves, speak to a mare as if exchanging secrets, and in the evening she'd take in extra feed to sell for a few coins. It was honest, quiet work. It was enough. The day the merchant's boy disappeared, a weathered sky had been holding back rain like a clenched fist. People had been nervous for days, rations running low, a fever going through the schoolhouse children. The merchant, Jeb Caro, had arrived in town that morning and left his boy Tommy to run an errand before the storm began. Tommy never returned. Rumor metastasized with the rain. At first it was whispers. "Did you see him near the old creek? Maybe he ran off." Then a child cried, and it was as if the town needed an answer faster than truth could arrive. Men gathered in small, red-faced knots, and fear made their voices louder, sharper. Elara was sweeping the livery when the accusation came. She heard it like a stone dropped in a well, a single loud sound, and then the hollow echo. Someone had seen Tommy in the lane near the river. Someone swore, and someone else said they'd seen Elara too, carrying a satchel. Motions had their own gravity. People are made to form into mobs with very little effort when there is a single target. The sheriff tried to calm them. His voice was small compared to the hunger for immediate action. By dusk, a group had formed. They came with torches and work-rough hands and the kind of certainty that comes from having assigned blame already. They dragged Elara from the livery as she managed to gather up her broom. She did not fight. What fight could she offer against weathered men who believed the story they had already told themselves? She only asked, in a voice so soft it might have been the wind, "Tommy is missing. Where is he?" They answered for her. "He took and he ran. He was seen with her. We will have justice." They meant something else by justice, something loud enough to balance the fear in their own chests. They took her to the old hanging tree at the valley's edge, a gnarled sentinel from older times when the law had been looser and men had taken more into their own hands. The tree had its place in lore. Its roots were said to drink from the bones of old grudges. A noose is not a complicated thing. A rope, a tight loop, a decision. Even the description of it need not be vivid to be terrible. To Elara, it was only the cruel conclusion the town had come to without asking very many questions. Nana Wren watched from the doorway of their small cabin, hands clamped together until the knuckles paled. Her voice did not rise to a plea. It was quieter than that. It was an offering to the sky. "You are two rivers," she whispered, as if the words might float across the valley and turn the mob's anger to rain. But the town does not listen to small voices when they are fed the sight of someone to punish. Elara stood beneath the tree as the crowd arranged itself like a folding of weathered paper into a shape ready to be burned. She saw men she had traded with at the market, women who had once smiled politely past her in church. She saw Sheriff Amos standing close enough to see her, his mouth a thin line. The ritual of it all, scolding, the naming, the small ceremonial shouting, felt to her like a play. A play she did not write. Alone in the distance, cloaked by the ridge and the half-light, Calder Hensley watched from where he had come for water and news of the town. The rancher had been in Wren's Gulch only to trade for a wagon spring and a new bit for a gelding. He had no love of towns or their loud decisions. He liked dirt and the predictable language of animals and the honest hardness of his own hands. The life of the Hensley place had been reduced to routine since his wife's death. Work, the fields, the horses, and evenings where he counted the years by the absence of laughter. When Calder saw Elara under the tree, there was a small, unwanted flare behind his ribs. It was not pity. He did not think in such simple terms for long. It was something like recognition of someone being led to be ended, not because they were guilty, but because the town could not hold its uncertain fear any other way. Calder was not a man who sought trouble, but for a moment, his loneliness and his sense of what is owed to another human being pushed him forward like a gust. He tied his horse with a flick of motion, as if the world was something he could ready with a strap. He did not plan his next movements. He had never been good at plans at that scale. But he felt the weather change in his chest, a tightening that would not go. When the mob's leader raised his voice for the last time and the noose lowered, Calder rode out of the shadow and into the space between life and the decision made to end it. No bells tolled. There was only the sound of his horse's hooves and the shuddering silence of people who were going to witness something and be measured by it later. Elara did not know him. When he pushed through the nearest men, rifle held high, a coat in his other hand, there was just one thing he said, low and blunt and almost a vow. "You're not hanging her." Words can stop a place's breath. The crowd turned, confused between anger and the sudden, unexpected interruption. Calder's arrival, a stranger protecting someone the town had already decided to hate, felt like a fissure. It was the beginning of something that would be called many things later. Reckless, noble, selfish. For now it was one man's refusal to be part of a quick, bad ending. When the rope was cut and coat was thrown, Elara's world narrowed to the rhythm of a single heart beating not with the town's rhythm, but in the small, sharp beat that comes from surviving. The immediate future was not clean or certain. It bristled with questions, but it had, suddenly and without permission, a place to go. Calder had never been what the town of Wren's Gulch expected a man to be. He had the look of those who survived too much, a face lined by sun and worry, a jaw that did not yield often, and a silence that could be as wide as the prairie. The Hensley Ranch belonged to that kind of silence. Its fences kept more than cattle inside. They measured the distance between people. Calder kept to the western side of Bear Ridge because it suited him, and because solitude had become a sort of armor after the letters stopped coming, and the sound of his own children's laughter became a thing he had to conjure rather than hear. He did not intend to become an answer to anyone. Most of the mountain moves in the morning without asking for permission. That day he had been heading back to his wagon with a new bit when the sound of a crowd reached him like thunder. By the time he arrived at the edge of town, the wind had changed and the town had decided its accounting. He rode in only because his own chest would not hold the sight of a woman under a rope without doing something he would later have to explain to himself. When he cut the rope, the sound was small, a whisper of hemp, and Elara fell, though not into anything soft. She fell into his arms, into the smell of saddle oil and gunmetal, and a coat that had kept one man's chest warm through a great many winters. She had been left to dangle on a story's end. And all at once a man who had been content to mind his own field decided he would not be part of closing that story the town had written. For a few seconds the world was a mess of shouting and the snapping of torches. Calder's voice carried like a bell as he fired a warning shot into the air. It was not meant to kill, it was a punctuation mark. The guns went quiet and the faces in the crowd shifted like weather. Some looked frightened that someone would intervene. Others looked enraged at a man stepping in where they felt justice should be enacted. Many simply wanted to avoid being chosen later for a jail, or for having chosen wrong. He threw a coat over Elara's shoulders. It was habit more than warmth. He threw his wife's old wool over hers because he had never learned to let such things go. The coat smelled of spent winters and the faint print of another life. For Elara it felt like a shield, but it also felt like an odd, sudden promise. She could not name what the world was offering. She could only feel the steadiness in the arm that held her. "Ride back to the ranch," Calder told the crowd in the straight, low voice of a man who had once been used to giving orders that needed to be obeyed. "Leave her be. If anyone follows, I'll make sure you don't come back." It was less a defense and more a declaration. There would be consequences if they continued. They did not pursue them at first. People like to tell themselves that a small cruelty is a one-time thing. It is harder to admit that they have allowed a pattern to form. The sheriff stepped forward, words shaped like a half-apology. "Hensley, this is..." But the sheriff's hand did not find his gun. The town had been playing at law and had settled into vigilantism. It had no stomach for anyone who challenged its way of keeping order. Calder mounted without speaking and guided Elara's horse with the unceremonious care of a man used to saddling and moving beasts that would not choose kindness. Elara, who had not been allowed time to reach for her own things, clung to the coat and the saddle like a child who had been plucked from a bad dream. She did not know the man beside her except for the shape of his hands, but when his fingers brushed the back of her wrist in a practiced motion to steady her, it felt less frightening than the hands that had tied the noose. Something in the steadiness of his touch made her breathe. The ride to the Hensley ranch was long enough for breath to find a rhythm again, and short enough that the memory of the rope could still be pressed into the corners of her mind. Calder did not speak much. When he did, his words were like small stones, carefully chosen and placed. "You're safe now," he said once, and Elara, who had known safety as a fragile and infrequent thing, let the word enter her like rain and dry earth. At the ranch, the house was a squat place built for practicality rather than comfort. Inside the walls were the arrangements of a life lived in the company of animals rather than people. A worn rocking chair, a table with a ring of old scratches from years of eating together, and a mantel where a few faded photographs leaned into each other like secret friends. Calder had kept it tidy because the place required it, and because order was an anchor in a world that had often shown him how easily things fall apart. He guided Elara to a spare room with a bed, clean though plainly made. "You can rest," he said, stripping off his wet gloves and setting them by the stove. "There's food. I'll see if Nana Wren will come by." His voice softened at the name, as if the mention of someone else's protection might be a kind of chorus to the protection he offered. Elara slept and woke in the same room for several days. Sleep took the rawness away from the image of rope, the way soap might take the edge from a stubborn stain. She dreamed of running rivers and of her mother's hands, and she woke to the smell of bread and stewed meat and the quiet footsteps of Calder moving around the house in the early hours. He would be out with the horses in the mornings and come back with the horses, coats glistening, and something about the natural rhythm of the chores eased the tension that had wedged itself into her shoulders. They did not speak of the hanging the way two people might in a play. There were no words that could contain the full scope of what had happened. Instead, there was the slow work of living, mending a saddle, bringing in wood, checking fences. Calder taught with a certain blunt kindness. Elara learned with a hunger she hadn't let herself feel in years. The horses responded to her hand, and she began to see those patient eyes smile back. The town, meanwhile, did not stop talking. Men stopped by the Hensley property at odd hours, pretending their visit was to trade or to ask about a mule. Calder met them on the fence with a calm that impressed and frustrated them in equal measure. He told them the truth in small doses. Elara was staying. She was not hiding anything that he knew of. He did not plead her innocence as if it needed to be proven beyond a shadow of doubt. He simply said she would remain under his roof. There is a distance between defending someone and claiming them. Calder's defense was a line drawn in the soil of his property. He was clear about his terms. It was enough to keep most people away. Those who came with malice left sooner than they might have otherwise, because standing against one man alone, even a quiet man who had kept to himself for years, felt lonelier than they were comfortable admitting. In the quiet hours, over small meals and the work of a shared life, Elara and Calder built a fragile architecture of trust. Elara told small stories about her mother's songs and the names of herbs. Calder told stories in fragments of a wife who had laughed like wind chimes and of fields that needed tending. They did not talk about names like half-blood, except to let those words pass like clouds. They spoke instead of horses that would not eat, of a broken fence, of the stubbornness of the land. At night, after the lamp was put out and the house settled into its animal sounds, Elara would lie awake and watch Calder's silhouette at the window. He read alone and sometimes hummed the lines of an old soldier's tune under his breath. She began to understand something that had been invisible, that saving someone does not mean you own them. His protection did not come with claims. It was, oddly, an invitation to be human again. The rhythm of the ranch settled on them like a blanket, rough in places, warm where it mattered. Spring moved slow that year, bearing its share of hard winds and bright, sudden sun. Elara learned to coax stubborn seeds into life along the vegetable patch beside the barn. She learned the names of the horses and the nuances in a mare's cough. Calder watched her work with a look that was sometimes admiring and sometimes guarded, as if he was measuring whether vulnerability was a thing worth exposing again. The town's gossip hummed at the edge of everything like an insect summer. It found its way into the stable when the men came to trade or to drink, into the general store's ledgers when people wanted to buy feed. But gossip is often recycled jealousy or fear in a new costume. It found less purchase on the Hensley land than people expected. The ranch had the stubbornness of a place that had been lived in and fought for. It had a way of taking people's attention and sending it back out to the fields, where the horses and fences had a more honest claim on a person's energy. Elara and Calder fell into a rhythm of companionable silence. They shared chores and, sometimes, stories. He taught her to shoot a rifle at a distance, not to teach her violence, but to give her a skill that meant she could protect herself if the world demanded it. She taught him a few of Nana Wren's herbs for aches and a tea that could soothe a fever. In the evenings, they would sit at the kitchen table while the radio, if one can call the single battered harmonica Calder kept a radio, sat silent on the mantel. They ate simply, and in that simplicity, discovered the small architecture of care. Compassion is a strange, gradual thing. It is not a fireworks show. It comes like water in a parched well, slowly, then with power enough to change shapes. Calder had loved once, deeply and loudly, in a way that left empty rooms speaking when laughter died. He had no illusions that such things would return easily. Yet there it was, the soft realization that he cared for someone beyond the clear functions of work and neighborliness. He resented himself for it, and then resented himself less. A man can be stubborn about many things. Stubbornness sometimes serves as protection. Elara watched him with clear eyes. She had learned to be careful of people who said too many soft words. She had learned to measure safety by the steadiness of actions rather than promises. His actions were relentless in their simplicity. He fed the horses, fixed a broken gate, and brought her a cup of tea with the exacting patience of someone who understands the virtue of routine. As the weeks went by and the weather slowly warmed, the two of them began to share a language of small gestures. Elara would patch the frayed ends of Calder's gloves. He would leave a wedge of bread on her usual plate when she was late from the fields. They began to carve their place into the ranch together. It was affectionate work, without pageantry. Sometimes a look would pass between them, and the air would crack with an awkwardness that was softer than embarrassment and no less honest. One morning, as they sat on the back stoop drinking bitter coffee and watching the sun wind its way up the ridge, Marla Jensen arrived with a basket. Marla, who had been the blacksmith's daughter and Elara's uncommon friend, had been keeping a careful eye on the town. She had been the one who had first argued, in a quiet way, that the group that seized Elara had done the town more harm than good. "You're playing a dangerous game, staying out here," Marla said, setting the basket down and looking at Calder with the kind of frankness that has no patience for pretensions. "People still ask if you rolled in gold when you left." "They ain't fools," Calder shrugged. "They'll do what they always do," he said. "I ain't looking to get in a fight." Marla's look softened as she turned to Elara. "You're getting better," she said. "You're not like you were. The way you move in the barn now." "You belong here." Marla's voice carried the weight of someone grateful for an honest friend. "It was a small validation," But to Elara, it mattered more than any council meeting in which the town elders argued over reputations. The season changed slowly. The farmstead grew flushed with new green. A colt that had been skeptic and standoffish when Elara first touched him bent to her hand one evening and allowed her to pick at the scab on his knee. She broke into a grin that was so rare she startled Calder, who had forgotten what it sounded like. "You did that?" he said, as if it were a small miracle he had seen happen. She only smiled back and ran her fingers through the colt's mane. As they built their days, the town's need to punish waned as other things filled its members. Attention, daughters marrying, a new shipment of salt arriving, the sheriff's own troubles with taxes. But prejudice has a way of hiding under other things, like a sleeping animal ready to stir. One evening, a boy from the merchant's stable came riding up the dirt lane. He wore a letter tied to his wrist, a small sign that news would follow. It was a subtle thing, the way small events can shift a placid surface and send ripples across a pond. The boy's arrival put a strain in the air like distant thunder. The horseman turned out to be a messenger from town. He brought notices and an invitation to a fair that the mayor hoped would encourage trade. People came and went from the ranch that day, and for a moment the larger world pressed against the fences they had made for comfort. It was the sort of normalcy they had both whispered about at nights, the hope that enough honest work can dull the edges of fear. Yet, beneath the everyday, the threads that tied up old accusations tugged. The merchant's son, everyone suspected, would someday be found. That thought pulled men's memories like threads being plucked on an old guitar. The mob's original certainty had been fed by lack of evidence and the readiness to accept a target. Now the town had cause to look back, and with looking comes the hard possibility of change. For Elara, the ranch had become a place where she could lay down the burdens of being a rumor. For Calder, it had become a place where his heart could take baby steps from being locked away to being shown a small door and a key. Neither expected fireworks. They only expected the honest steadiness of a life tended day by day. They did not yet know how quickly the town's weather could shift, nor did they know how they would be tested by the truth that would arrive like a guest at their fence. News arrives in a town like the first bird call after a long winter, sharp, impossible to ignore. When the merchant's son returned, he rode in with the rattle of a drum in the sky and the taste of other places on his tongue. Tommy Caro rode into Wren's Gulch with a grin that suggested mischief more than malice. He had a new jacket, dust from a road that went beyond the valley, and an attitude that was entirely his own. He had run, the kids would say. No great mystery. He had run to join a traveling troupe, maybe, or a small circus or a band of traders that moved like a river across the plains. For him, the town's grips and schedules had been a kind of smallness one could step out of with the right sort of courage. He returned simply because the roads were long and the things that look like freedom sometimes pull a person back as surely as a storm. When the news reached the Hensley Ranch, there was a brief, sharp intake of breath between Elara and Calder. They had not known the boy's fate, only that his absence had fed a small, poisonous certainty in the town. Now, with his return, the truth would need to be told. It would be messy. It would be public. And in public, the town had a way of performing apologies as if they were theater. The merchant, Jeb Caro, rode with Tommy to Calder's fence. The two men, father and son, dismounted with an air of having returned from an adventure rather than admitting to a mistake. The crowd gathered quickly, as crowds do when curiosity seeks the comfort of spectacle. Calder met them at the gate with a face that said, mostly, that he would not be moved by public pressure. He had already staked his claim. Tommy rode up, a flush of impudence painted across his cheekbones. He had not been attacked. He had not been harmed. He had been a runaway who had found new things along the road and had chosen to come back when the boredom of that life found him. The town's anger folded into confusion and then shame as the facts reassembled themselves like a picture being set straight. Jeb Caro's voice trembled at first. He had been quick to believe what the crowd suggested, but as Tommy stood there, waving his hat and telling stories of the road, The mercilessness of the accusation hit him like a cold wind. The older men in town shuffled their feet. A few of them turned their heads in a kind of embarrassed apology, the sort of nod that meant they had been wrong but were not sure how to make it right. Calder stood close to Elara during the scene, not touching her but standing a private distance like a man who had done what he felt was right and was willing to defend himself and the woman at his home from further harm. Elara's hands curled inwards and then relaxed. Her face registered something complicated, relief layered with pain. People apologized differently depending on what they wished to be forgiven of. Most of them found small words, offered money, or attempted half-hearted gestures of normalcy. Sheriff Amos stood before the crowd like a man who had seen too many sides of human nature to be surprised by any of them, but that did not mean he was without conscience. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We did wrong," he said. His words were blunt and not theatrical. It was the kind of apology that acknowledged a failure and tried to set things back in place. A few heads nodded. Some shuffled away. The moral calculus of the town had shifted. Blame had been disproved in the bright noon of truth. But truth does not always set things as neatly as people wish. The ledger of harm is not zeroed by the return of a runaway. People who had hung Elara at the tree, who had watched, had marked their own names in an account that would take longer to settle. Shame is a slow currency. After the crowd dispersed and the rustle of gossip softened into the daily beat of trade and chores, Elara and Calder sat on the stoop and watched the sun dip behind Bear Ridge. Neither spoke at first. Speech would have been clumsy. The day's events had been loud, and yet, in the hush that followed, something else became clear to them. Words like forgiveness had a long afterlife. One could be forgiven by a town and yet carry the memory of the rope in the chest like a bruise. Elara turned to Calder and asked the question that had both hovered and haunted since the first time she woke from the noose. "Why?" He looked at her as if the question had been an apple thrown in his direction. He could answer with 1,000 small reasons. His sense of right, the sight of another human being treated unfairly, the memory of his own grief that had taught him not to let the world harden him into a man who turned away. But the answer that came out sounded simpler. Because you were there, and I could not let that be the end. She let those words sit between them. They were not grand. They were not meant to be. They were human and small, and that was what made them matter. The next days were filled with the work of repairing what is reparable. The merchant, Jeb, left a small bundle of food at the ranch as a token and apologized in his blunt merchant way. A few families came by to ask if Elara needed stitches or if her horses had been harmed. Some even left with small offerings of vegetables. It was enough to begin turning the town's face back towards her life. But wounds, even in the best of cases, leave traces. Elara's nights were sometimes restless. She woke from dreams where rope was a river and the river would not stop. Calder would wake too at those times. He would sit up and listen in the faint lantern light to the house's sleep sounds, and he would find her in the courtyard, sometimes, tracing the old hanging tree's bark as if searching for something to claim from it, other than memory. One evening, as the dusk reddened the fields, Elara walked to the hanging tree. Calder followed at a respectful distance. She ran her hand along the bark and then looked at him, a small smile that was not free of sorrow but carried the first real lightness he'd seen. "We should not let that tree have more power than it deserves," she said. He smiled in return. "I suppose we could carve something else there," he suggested. She looked at him then with an odd certainty and nodded. "Something that remembers what came after," she said, "not what came before." They decided to carve words into the bark, not as a lecture but as a record, a small public admission that from the day she had been saved, there had been a new story being written. They chose words that felt true and quiet. The act of carving, slow and deliberate, was less about triumph and more about witness. It was a small ceremony of mutual survival. They did not know then that the carving would become a part of the town's memory in a way that would surprise older men and warm the hands of children who would later trace the letters as if learning how to read a new kind of poetry. They only knew the immediate, that there were other things in the world worth tending than old resentments. They knew also that whatever came next would require them to stand again, together, because the town's weather could never be fully predicted. Seasons wheel on the plains, indifferent to the small dramas that make up human lives. Summer came with heat that made dust shimmer over the fields and cooled at night with starlight that tasted like coin. The Hensley Ranch grew into something that looked less like a house, where a solitary man kept a bed for occasional visitors, and more like a home with the traffic of life. Neighbors stopping by for coffee, the clinking of a plate at the kitchen window, a colt's lazy whinny in the pasture. Elara and Calder settled into their new normal with habits that fit like old clothes. Their affection did not explode into an operatic display. It unfolded in small victories. A joint laugh in the kitchen over a burnt piece of bread, a hand given without fanfare to steady a ladder, a midday rest under the shade of cottonwoods when the work had been long. They learned the subtle languages of each other's pain and joy, and they matched them like sheepdogs that know the exact moment to pull and when to yield. The town changed in small, uneven ways. Some men never forgave themselves. Some never admitted their guilt aloud. A few families withdrew their invitations for the sake of appearances. But more people came around. Their reasons were pragmatic more than noble. Calder's steadiness and the reputation of the ranch as a place of fair trade. Elara's ability with animals. The practical reality that a town must have working people to survive. Practicality often becomes the scaffold on which fuller compassion is built. A year after the hanging, children would run past the old tree with their arms wide, and a carved line would read simply, "From death came love, and from love, freedom." It was Elara's idea to carve that line. Calder had sawn the letters out with a stubborn concentration that made their edges clean. The line was not a sermon, only a witness. People read it and judged it according to their own hearts. Children, unburdened by a town's older shames, liked the phrase and sometimes tried to decipher the meaning with the kind of serious curiosity only young ones have. Calder planted a small patch of apple trees in a place where the wind seemed kinder. He and Elara would walk among them sometimes at dusk and wonder aloud which of their small hopes might come true. They spoke of no children of their own, respecting the bones of their pasts. Yet they allowed for possibility in a way that had been closed before. They allowed themselves to hope for laughter that would not vanish overnight. Nana Wren became a regular guest at the house, her presence like a stitch in a garment. She brought pies on certain Sundays and the stories of old songs. She taught the occasional neighbor a herb remedy and had a way of making herself known in a voice that neither demanded nor begged. The town eventually learned to accept her warmth as if it were a part of the area's correct weather. On rare occasions, the past would pull them back. A man would mutter at the market, or an old woman would hiss something unkind across a street. Those times stung, and they had to be repaired. Sometimes by conversations, sometimes by silence. But Calder and Elara had a shared method now. They would plant their hands into the soil, mend what needed mending, and then sit quietly and let the day pass. There were festivals, small county fairs, and harvest celebrations that felt at first like a stage where old tensions might reignite. Instead, they became places where people practiced gentleness in public. Calder would show Elara a way of tucking a blanket around her shoulders during evening processions, and she would watch him with an affection that made his stern face soften. They danced once badly, and once with an odd grace that made them both laugh afterward. Love, in the end, was less about declarations and more about the daily choice to tend another person. Calder would often say that saving Elara had rescued him as much as it had rescued her. He had been a man trudging through his life in weathered boots, and now he had someone who could meet him at the end of a long day and make him whole in ways he had not allowed himself to imagine. Elara found, over months and then years, that the label given to her by the town did not hold the power it once had. It was a word the town used to explain its own fear. Once she had a place to plant roots and a companion to share the work, the slur withered in the same way weeds die after planting morning glories. She taught the town's children to ride and spoke at the school once, not as a crusade but as a practical class, how to care for an animal's wound, how to mend leather. The children listened as children do, hungry for new knowledge, and some of them left wiser than when they arrived. Years later, when people asked about the old hanging tree, the story was told in a softer voice, often buffered by the years that had smoothed the edges of the memory. People would say, "I remember when Elara came to Hensley's," and the answer would be simple and true: she stayed. The memory carried the shape of a small town, learning to be less cruel than it had been before, and there were small private ripples that mattered to Calder and Elara alone. On a late autumn evening, with a harvest moon swollen and steady, Calder took Elara's hand by the kitchen window. He did not stage a grand confession. He let the words come flat and honest. "I owe you my life more than you'll ever know," he said. Elara looked at him with a softness that had taken the better part of a year to grow. "We both saved each other," she answered, "and we'll keep choosing it." She placed her hand over his, an insistence that did not require fanfare. They carved one last thing into the old tree together later that year, a small symbol rather than words. 2 lines crossed, and a tiny, imperfect heart beneath it. It was less public than the phrase before, meant more for themselves than for the town. When friends asked about it, Elara would shrug and say, simply, "A promise." Promises sometimes become roots. Roots bind a thing to the earth and make it harder to pull up. Calder and Elara planted their roots where the soil could hold them, watered with the daily acts of tending and choice. The Hensley Ranch became a place where, in a small way, a town learned that mercy is an action, not a story told to justify cruelty. They lived out their days on the ridge with the horses and the trees, and the carved letters on the old hanging tree became less an accusation and more a reminder that where cruelty once settled like frost, human kindness, steady and often unspoken, can warm the ground enough for new life to take hold. Love is not born from perfection. It grows from courage, kindness, and the choice to stand beside someone when the world turns away. Elara and Calder prove that even in a land hardened by dust and prejudice, a single act of compassion can rewrite fate itself. From a noose meant to end a life, they built a love strong enough to heal 2 broken souls, and to remind us all that mercy is the truest kind of strength. If this story of hope, redemption, and frontier love touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, because out here, every tale rides with passion, courage, and the kind of love that never surrenders. Join the journey and don't miss the next story where love conquers even the wildest West.